and welcome to my Corporate Responsibility podcast. Over recent decades, business has negatively contributed to the societal and environmental challenges we face today. Too many corporate misdemeanors have revealed a culture of greed and disregard for the consumers and communities it serves, and the environment in which it operates. I am ADRIENNE Marsden, a business student at the University of Winchester, studying for a Doctorate of Business Administration. Join me on a journey of conversation and curiosity to discover what the business school community thinks business is and should be doing to reset the dial of corporate responsibility. How can it regain our trust and ultimately be a force for good? This podcast series invites you to join my conversation with guests from academia and business as we debate peer-reviewed papers from contemporary thinkers to examine what business needs to do to regain its social license to operate. Each episode will review one paper. Similar to a book club, my guests and I will draw out the points that most resonate with us and what we are left wanting to know more about. Each paper can be found on my YouTube channel. Whether you're a fellow business student or someone interested in wanting to be a better corporate citizen, I hope that you find this series helpful. Today's paper is entitled Bad Management Theories Are Destroying Good Management Practice by Sumantra Ghoshal, published in 2005. Ghoshal argues that many of the now well-publicized corporate scandals occurred due to business practices that are rooted in academic theories that are underpinned by an ideology of collective pessimism born out of Milton Friedman's liberalism. For example, he draws attention to the theoretical foundation on which corporate governance sits, namely agency theory. This theory argues that managers cannot be trusted to do their job, which is to maximize shareholder value. This distrust is therefore overcome by aligning managers' incentives with those of shareholders, thereby ensuring that their overriding motivation is to increase profitability. Furthermore, transaction cost analysis theory, which underpins organizational design, calls for tighter monitoring to prevent opportunistic behaviors, creating a culture of compliance rather than cooperation. Ghoshal suggests that this collective pessimism of human and organizational behavior has allowed business schools to discharge themselves of moral responsibility. He goes on to say that this pessimistic view, along with the fact that management theories are studied through a social science as opposed to a physical science lens, has led to what Ghoshal describes as a double hermeneutic. If a theory gains currency through a social science perspective, it will become self-fulfilling. If the theorists believe that managers are bad, eventually they will be. It's my great pleasure to welcome my guest, James McCalman, Professor of Leadership Studies at Portsmouth Business School. Thank you for your time today, James. What I'd like to suggest is that we start by sharing our overall thoughts about this paper and then dive into a couple of key points, 2 or 3 key points that resonated for both of us, and then wrap up with what we might be left wanting to know more from having read this paper. So if I could hand over to you first of all, if you could just share what your sort of general observations of the paper were.
Yeah, thanks. My initial thoughts of this were it was a really good title in search of an article. If I were to read the words bad management theories are destroying good management practices, then read the article, I think maybe he addresses the bad management theories, but completely ignores the notion of good management practices. It just doesn't get mentioned in this article whatsoever. If I reflected back on what the world was like in 2005, and remember this is just before the global financial crisis, I think he does have a lot of good points in relation to being critical of business school research and the way that it has grown up. I think he maybe perhaps exists in a business school world which is not one that I know, because most of my academic career has been in business schools where the exchange of ideas, although combative, was quite constructive. So from that perspective, I think he's maybe coming from one of those Russell Group elite business school backgrounds where the competition for professorial ego is quite strong and perhaps less collaborative. Maybe there's too much of an emphasis on the economics of business schools and maybe not about what business schools do in the real world, in a practical world. It's too macroeconomic for me and not micro enough. And I think maybe that's some of the points that we can begin to debunk as we go through the paper.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, what was that? Professorial ego. I like that. Yes, obviously calling out the fact this paper was published in 2005. 16 years have passed, and obviously a lot has happened during that time. And sadly, Professor Ghoshal died before the paper was published. So it would be interesting to know where his work would have evolved from that time. What struck me as a new business school student, we were given this paper as the first paper to read when I joined my DBA studies 2 years ago. And it was quite shocking, actually, to read this. As I entered the business school community as a student, I was quite concerned by what I was reading. Was this what it was going to be like? So it's reassuring to hear what you've just said now, that this isn't your actual experience. And also, I had never really thought about the role that business schools and academics have played in these bad practices. I've always thought these are bad businesses, these are bad companies. It never struck me that underpinning the theories and the practices that play out within a corporate setting came from theories. So those were the two that particularly struck me.
Yeah. I think, to me, I think it's less element of the theories. It tells you more about the Premier League of business schools than it does anything else. And certainly I would agree with some of the points he makes. Economics does tend to dominate business schools, and that macroeconomic perspective does seem to drive a certain way of researching and a certain way of propounding arguments. But I think that's more about the Americanization of business schools than it is about what happens in, say, the UK, or certainly in my experience in Europe, which has got a far more collaborative feel about it. You know, we tend to share ideas and principles more widely. So I think he may be right in criticizing business school research with some justification, but I think he ignores that academic endeavour that we have in, say, organisation theory, organisation behaviour, change management. It's not the world I recognise. Certainly, one of the illustrations for me is he talks an awful lot about how those who are researchers as academics get prioritised over others. I think there's an element of truth in that in terms of publish or perish, which is very much the American way of things. But I can remember back in the 80s as a boy lecturer being told by my senior professors that I was not worth it if I wasn't a good teacher as well as a good researcher. And I've always carried that with me in terms of hopefully giving other academics a leg up. They need to be good at the teaching angle. And research pedagogy is a really significant element, I would argue, in terms of business school environments. When we get on to his main thrust, though, I think there's some interesting stuff there. He does seem to be overly focused on the Chicago School of Economics or the Austrian School of Economics or Milton Friedman, and that as the causal element of where that bad research is coming from. Again, that's macroeconomics. It's not microeconomics, and certainly not theory of the firm as I would recognise it. Again, I can remember as a boy lecturer talking about managerial economics and how it has to interrelate with the way organisational behaviour works for it to be realistic.
Does it strike you as too simplistic then? I mean, the model as I saw it, the way he does that sort of hierarchy of, like you say, the Chicago School, the theory of Friedman, and then as I've referenced in the introduction about agency theory and cost transactional analysis, it was quite concerning for me to look at that, how that has filtered through in his view. I mean, as I say, I'm speaking here as a student. You're coming from a position of an experienced, competent academic and, as you say, researcher. For me, I was struck by almost the simplicity of how this had manifested, and worried that that's what underpinned the way corporations were operating. So for me, it's not just about this. You referenced about how it being more collaborative. in UK and European settings. But if people are still collaborating over the old paradigm, are we still just reinventing the same thing? Because he also talks about people not risking their careers, which I thought, golly, that is rather concerning, that you wouldn't call out this elephant in the room, if you like, that everything that we are researching and developing still has this underpinning collective pessimism, as Ghoshal calls it.
And that's why I said it's a good title in search of some relevance or significance. I think what he was trying to do was to trigger some debate, because I think realistically, in the business world that I live in, you would obviously recognise that the publisher-Pero argument is quite strong, and that has continued to grow. I do have a degree of sympathy for my younger colleagues, because they're constantly being pressured into publications to get promotions or to get tenure or to get a move to another university. That's certainly true of the business school environment. But then when you think of what he talks about things like shareholder value.
Yeah.
And talks about this transactional notion that managers cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
That's not the business school world or the MBA world I've grown up in.
Right.
Part of my basis of understanding and teaching leadership is to say, you're here because you want to become a better leader. You're a good manager. You want to become a better leader. And then I then devolve into worlds of, well, what is an authentic leader? What is an ethical leader? What are the challenges that face you in your organization, in your sector, that perhaps detract you from becoming or behaving in an ethical way? He obviously predates the global financial crisis.
Yes.
And that, again, has got a lot to do with perhaps the macro side of things and the behaviours of that type of individual.
Is this the way it used to be? And that's what, the caveat here is this paper was written 16 years ago and based on historical perspective on how, these theories that were developed. Do you see that there is credibility in what he's saying about how it used to be? Absolutely. I agree with you. And I'm sure every MBA program I'm on and undergraduate business degrees, I would hope, do have a greater ethical and, socially driven underpinning to them. I don't know whether that is the case, but let's hope it is. But he's coming from a point of, historically, this is how things emerged and evolved. The things that I was picking out was, as you say, this model of shareholder maximization. What he's saying is it's the simple way of measuring through research the effectiveness of business. It's much easier to measure monetary factors than it is to the human. So he's saying that they strip out any human element, that people behave in certain ways, and that not everybody is self-regarding. He talks about self-regarding, other regarding, and I think process regarding, that those theories stripped out the human element of organizations. Do you have any recollection of when you were in your early years of your career that was the norm?
No, because I think one of the things he's missing, one of the points that he misses, is that if you look at this transactional analysis perspective, he makes the point that this leads to opportunism and therefore managers and employees cannot be trusted. But if we look at the research work, certainly in organizational theory and organizational behavior in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, it was characterized by lessening control to gain commitment of managers and employees. So the word culture isn't mentioned once in his article, and he doesn't grasp the micro element of how organizations behave very strongly, which is why I think he's coming from that Premier League American business school macro perspective and not being capable of getting into an organization to see how they work. I do have some sympathy with it. I'm reminded of the work that Christopher Bones did. Christopher Bones was former Dean of Henley Business School and talked about why do we get the leaders that we have. And he talked about a leadership crop whose values were driven by a desire to be seen as successful. And that meant embracing all the trappings of success. He called them the L'Oreal generation. Why are they important? Because they're worth it. And part and parcel of that was things like the notion of the war for talent that McKinsey developed in the 1990s.